So Meghan Markle is sitting on 220,000 jars of jam in a California warehouse, and the official story about why it's there completely fell apart in exactly 8 weeks. That's not me speculating. That's not a palace source whispering to a tabloid. That's her own brand spokesperson saying one thing to People magazine in January and then saying the exact opposite thing to ITV News in March. And the contradiction is so clean and so specific that once you see the two statements next to each other, the entire international expansion narrative just dissolves. Here's what happened. Back in January, Reddit users discovered that the As Ever website had a glitch where you could add unlimited quantities to your cart and it would show you the real inventory numbers. Not the marketing version where everything looks perpetually almost sold out. The actual warehouse count. 220,000 jars of jam, 30,000 jars of honey, 90,000 candles, 80,000 tins of flour sprinkles, 70,000 bottles of wine. Total retail value sitting there unsold. $21.8 million. Now, inventory in a warehouse isn't automatically scandalous. Brands manufacture in bulk. They release in batches. That's normal. The story isn't the number. The story is what the brand said about the number. And then what the brand said about the number 8 weeks later when the questions got more specific. When the Reddit glitch went viral and suddenly everyone was talking about $21 million of unsold lifestyle products, the response came fast. Sources described as having direct knowledge of the business told People magazine that the inventory was actually a sign of success. Their exact phrasing, and I'm quoting directly here, "It doesn't take a genius to work out that what is left points to a company doing extremely well." That large stock order was obviously part of the international expansion plans the Duchess has spoken about for the brand. Obviously. That was the word they chose. Not reportedly, not potentially, not we're exploring options. Obviously part of active international expansion plans already underway. Confident, clear, on the record through a trusted outlet delivered by people who supposedly had direct knowledge of the business. 8 weeks later, Meghan's trip to Australia included what were described as private business meetings aimed at expanding As Ever internationally. The story picked up traction. Journalists started asking actual on-the-record questions instead of accepting unnamed source characterizations. And the As Ever spokesperson issued a formal statement to the press. Here's what they said this time. "This is speculation. No decisions have been made about when or where international expansion might take place. Entering new markets is a considered process." No decisions have been made. Entering new markets is a considered process. The international expansion is speculative. So in January, it's obviously part of active international expansion plans already underway. In March, it's speculation, no decisions have been made. That's not a plan that changed. Plans that changed get described as changed plans. They have a before and an after that explains the shift. A spokesperson does not describe as speculation something that was previously an active plan. Speculation is the word you use for something that was never confirmed as a plan in the first place. Something that can be asserted privately to a friendly outlet under the cover of unnamed sourcing, but cannot be asserted publicly to a reporter who's going to ask follow-up questions that require specific, attributable, documented answers. The warehouse didn't get lighter between January and March. The inventory numbers didn't change. The regulatory requirements didn't shift. The only thing that changed was the level of scrutiny the explanation was facing. And when that scrutiny required a direct, on-record attributable answer, the explanation changed with it. The word to focus on isn't even obviously, though that word does the most damage in retrospect when you place it next to what the spokesperson said later. The word to notice is speculation. That's a very specific word with a very specific meaning in corporate communications, and it means this was never real. Now here's where it gets genuinely interesting, because even if the obviously part of the expansion plan's explanation had held firm and never changed, even if the spokesperson had backed up the January People magazine characterization rather than contradicting it, the whole thing would still have a serious problem sitting underneath it. The regulatory problem. Lady Colin Campbell named it on camera very clearly and very specifically, and as far as anyone following this story carefully can tell, the mainstream coverage that reported on the warehouse numbers did not follow that specific regulatory dimension up properly. Possibly because a detailed discussion of the Biosecurity Act 2015 and the Bicon inspection system is less immediately engaging than a photograph of jam jars. But the regulatory architecture is where the entire explanation collapses regardless of what the spokesperson said or didn't say. Her statement was straightforward. You cannot export food from one place all over the world because each place has different rules and regulations. Plain English, entirely correct, and specifically relevant to the scale of inventory sitting in California under the justification of international expansion. Here's the documented version. Australia, the specific market the Sussexes visited for those private business meetings, operates one of the more rigorous imported food regimes in the world. All imported food intended for sale must meet biosecurity import conditions and comply with the Australia-New Zealand Food Standards Code under both the Imported Food Control Act 1992 and the Biosecurity Act 2015. Risk category food is tested on arrival and held until results are returned. Shipments that fail do not sit waiting for resolution. They are re-exported or destroyed at the importer's expense. That's the regulatory consequence of a failed shipment in the Australian market. That's not a delay. That's your product getting incinerated and you paying for the privilege. The FDA in America provides export certification for human food products. As of 2024, that certification covers exactly 6 destination markets: Chile, China, the European Union, Saudi Arabia, Taiwan, and the United Kingdom. Australia is not on that list. Australia requires its own entirely separate regulatory pathway run through its own system, operating independently of anything the FDA certifies. And it's not just Australia. The European Union requires novel food compliance assessments for products that don't have a pre-existing history in EU markets. Japan requires specific health certificates and radiation testing documentation. South Korea requires Korean language labeling documentation prepared to specific regulatory projects. Every market is its own separate regulatory project, not a shipping label change, not a minor reformatting exercise, but a complete separate process per country with its own timeline, its own costs, and its own uncertainty about outcomes. The stock currently sitting in that California warehouse was manufactured for the US market. US labeling, US formulation review, US ingredient documentation reviewed under US food safety standards. To sell any of that inventory in Australia requires reformatting all labels to meet the Australian-New Zealand Food Standards Code, getting the product through the BICON inspection system, and potentially dealing with testing hold requirements before a single jar reaches a shelf. That's not a delayed launch. That's a product rebuild conducted per market. What this means in plain terms is that the 220,000 jars of jam cannot be shipped internationally under the current product formulation. They were manufactured for one market. They're certified for one market, they're labeled for one market, and the regulatory wall between US food certification and Australian food certification is not a technicality you can finesse with a well-timed press release. The people who placed the manufacturing order for 220,000 jars either knew this and placed the order anyway, in which case the international expansion explanation was never the real reason for the inventory scale, or they didn't know it. In which case, a $21 million inventory decision was made without checking the regulatory requirements of the markets it was supposedly being manufactured to serve. Neither option is flattering. Neither option supports the narrative that this is a well-run business executing a carefully planned global strategy. And neither option explains why 220,000 jars needed to exist in physical form before a single regulatory certification had been obtained for a single international market. Let's talk about what was actually being built in Australia, because this is where the story gets more interesting than a simple PR contradiction. The as-ever trademark filings in Australia were lodged with the Australian Intellectual Property Office in September 2024. Approved June 2025. 12 categories: skincare, candles, clothing, jewelry, homeware, podcast, yoga straps, pet feeding mats. Filed and approved 18 months before Netflix exited its equity position in March 2026. So the Australian brand protection strategy was already in progress while Netflix was still a full and active commercial partner, still publicly describing the brand as consistently selling out in record time. The trademark predates the Netflix departure by a year and a half. The architecture for what comes after Netflix was being built while Netflix was still publicly in. But here's the specific thing about that trademark. Registering a trademark in Australia does not certify a food product for sale in Australia. Those are two entirely separate regulatory processes. You can own the name as ever in every country on earth and still be legally unable to sell a single jar of jam in any of those countries without going through each country's own food safety certification. The trademark protects the brand name. The food certification permits the product. They're completely different documents, completely different processes, and apparently nobody explained that distinction before the manufacturing order was placed. Now read those 12 trademark categories again. Skincare, candles, clothing, jewelry, homeware, podcast, yoga straps, pet feeding mats. Jam and Honey does not need yoga straps in its trademark portfolio. A food and condiment brand does not need pet feeding mats registered in its name. A strawberry spread with a lifestyle aesthetic does not need podcast and clothing categories protected in its trademark filings. What those 12 categories suggest is that the Australian trademark was not filed to protect a jam business. It was filed to protect a significantly broader lifestyle operation, one that had been planned and architected considerably further in advance than the product launches suggested to the public. And one that extends well beyond food into categories that don't face the same regulatory certification barriers that food products face. Skincare doesn't require a BICON submission. Clothing doesn't need a novel food compliance assessment. Yoga straps don't need radiation testing certificates. If the 12 category Australian trademark was the actual strategic roadmap for the As Ever international launch, if Jam and Honey were the visible commercial entry point while the broader lifestyle operation was being built around it, then the regulatory wall the food products face is less of a fundamental obstacle and more of a specific problem for one category among 12. That reading makes the September 2024 filing considerably more interesting than it initially appears when you look at it only as a food brand, protecting its name in a new market. The jam was the visible commercially accessible product, the thing that generated the lifestyle content, the celebrity gifting, the Netflix association, the sold out launch moments. The 12 category trademark was the actual architectural footprint of what the operation was being built toward. And it makes the Netflix exit in March 2026, combined with the brand's own statement that it's now standing on its own 2 feet, look like a commercial pivot rather than a commercial failure. If the pivot away from a food-first Netflix-dependent structure toward a broader lifestyle and clothing operation was always the direction the 12 categories were pointing toward. Now let's talk about the Netflix dimension, because the timeline here is specific and the numbers sit in very uncomfortable proximity to each other. In August 2025, Netflix announced an extended deal with the Sussexes. Netflix's chief content officer, Bella Bajaria, made a specific public statement to justify the commercial decision. As Ever products were consistently selling out in record time. Stop on that phrase. Consistently selling out in record time. That was the chief content officer of the world's largest streaming platform on the record in a public statement designed to justify a major partnership renewal. 5 months later, January 2026, the website glitch. The full warehouse numbers become public. $21.8 million of inventory unsold, 220,000 jars of jam that were, according to the Netflix chief content officer, 5 months earlier, consistently selling out in record time. There are only 2 explanations available. Either the products were genuinely selling out in record time in August and something catastrophic happened to the sell-through rate in the subsequent 5 months, which would be a remarkable commercial collapse requiring its own explanation. Or the consistently selling out characterization described only the small, deliberately limited drops. The launch batches, where a few thousand units were released to create visible sellout moments while the bulk manufacturing run of hundreds of thousands of units sat untouched. In which case, the Netflix chief content officer's public statement used to justify a major commercial investment was describing a fraction of the inventory position. Specifically, the fraction that was selected and released in volumes calibrated to sell quickly and create visible scarcity, rather than the complete inventory picture that included the hundreds of thousands of units sitting in a warehouse at the same time. Those limited drops were occurring. In March 2026, Netflix exited the equity position entirely, distributed its allocated share of the product inventory internally to Netflix employees, which is the method of inventory liquidation available to a company unwinding a product partnership, and walked away. The brand is now, in its own spokesperson's phrasing, standing on its own 2 feet. Standing on $21 million of unsold product alone in a warehouse with expiration dates running at the same pace. They always run regardless of what the expansion plans say. Now let's talk about what Radar Online added to this picture. Because the personal financial dimension has a specific commercial weight here. Radar Online reported with insider sourcing that Prince Harry is privately in despair about the soaring cost tied to the global expansion goal. The specific framing, Meghan is more determined than ever to build as ever into a worldwide brand, while Harry is privately in despair about the soaring costs. Think about what soaring costs means in the precise context of what we've just described. Country by country food regulatory certification for each new international market. Separate BICON submissions for the Australian pathway alone. FDA export certification applications for markets currently outside its coverage. Relabeling runs per market, each requiring its own compliance review and production run. Distribution partnership establishment in each target country, which requires time, relationship building, and upfront commercial commitment. Potential reformulation reviews to meet EU novel food compliance standards. And sitting underneath all of that, the monthly warehousing cost on $21 million of inventory that is not cleared and has expiration dates moving closer with every week that passes. Every month, the warehouse holds unsold perishable stock. Two things happen simultaneously. The warehousing bill accumulates further, and the window of time in which the product can be sold at its full premium price shrinks. When expiration dates are eventually reached, the product either gets discounted to move it, and discounting a product designed as a luxury lifestyle brand at clearance pricing is the most efficient way to destroy the brand positioning the entire commercial architecture was built around. Or it gets disposed of entirely. Neither outcome is what 220,000 jars were manufactured to achieve. Harry reportedly watches the household's finances with genuine attention and genuine concern. He understands in a way that the brand's external communications may not fully reflect the actual gap between what As Ever generates in revenue and what the international expansion strategy requires in upfront cost before a single jar crosses a border. A man who gave up his country, his family, his military career, and his entire institutional identity to build a new life in Montecito is reportedly watching the finances of that new life and landing on despair about jam expansion costs. That's not a small signal about the state of the commercial operation, and it's not a reading of Harry that any of the public-facing As Ever communications acknowledge or address. Now, let's talk about the Lady Campbell observation that nobody properly followed up on, because it connects the warehouse numbers to a pattern that began long before As Ever existed. Lady Colin Campbell's value in this story is specific. She documented this operation before it was an operation. Her research for her 2020 book caught behaviors that were already consistent and already documentable from the available hotel and production records. The performance of a profile that the actual circumstances of the time did not yet require, at a point before anyone was paying close enough attention to notice or to treat those observations as significant rather than eccentric. Lady Colin Campbell, researching her 2020 book on the Sussexes, found something specific about Meghan's behavior before she had any meaningful public profile. She found that Meghan, when working as an actress in film production circles, was requiring hotel check-ins under a pseudonym, because she reportedly could not travel under her real name. Before the royal engagement, before any significant public recognition, at a point when, by Lady Campbell's own assessment, the wider American public would not have recognized her in a supermarket. The pseudonym before the fame. The elaborate security protocols before the genuine security requirement. The performance of a profile that the actual profile did not yet justify. Now look at 2026, multiple security escorts at a fashion show, magazine exclusives for a British Airways anniversary card, reported inability to shop at a supermarket due to overwhelming public attention, an Invictus Games appearance where the audience was small enough to have fit comfortably in a much smaller venue. Australia, where the public reception generated questions about the genuine level of interest. Harry, by contrast, visited Ukraine without anything approaching the apparatus that accompanies a Meghan public appearance. Catherine shops without reported incident. The pattern Lady Campbell identified in 2020 from pre-fame hotel records is visible in 2026 from current public appearance logistics. Same performance, different scale, different props. The pseudonym was the prop that the pre-fame performance required, a signal of significance in an environment where that significance was not yet independently established. The security detail at the fashion show is the prop that the current performance apparently requires, performing the same function in a different setting at a different scale. The celebrity grocery shopping she reportedly misses so dearly is the prop that ongoing public interest apparently cannot accommodate, even as public appearances in international markets attract audience sizes that suggest the level of recognition may be lower than the performance suggests. Harry visited Ukraine without anything approaching the apparatus that accompanies Meghan's public appearances. Catherine shops without reported incident and without a People magazine exclusive about the experience. The gap between the performance and the documentable all evidence of the profile that would require that performance is specific, consistent, and has been consistent across a long enough period that it's no longer deniable as coincidence or misperception. And the latest prop is the international expansion of a jam brand that cannot currently be internationally expanded under its existing product formulation. Publicly explained with a justification that changed within 8 weeks, backed by a Netflix endorsement that described consistently selling out in record time 7 months before the partnership ended. The warehouse is still full. The regulatory wall is still standing. The 8-week contradiction is fully documented. The 5-month gap between consistently selling out in record time and Netflix exiting is on the record. The 12-category Australian trademark is publicly filed and approved. The Radar online sourcing about Harry's despair about expansion costs is in print. None of this requires a palace source or a hostile biographer or a royal commentator with an agenda. The brand's own spokespersons provided the contradiction, one in January, one in March, from the same brand. The regulatory agencies publish their requirements openly as they always have. The Trademark Office published its records when the filings were approved. The Netflix executive went on record in a public statement. The warehouse numbers came from the brand's own website during a bug that nobody planned for. The story is in the sequence, and the sequence is fully documented. The thing that gets me about all of this is how unnecessary the contradiction was. If the brand had simply said nothing in January, if they'd let the warehouse number sit without the obviously part of active international expansion plans characterization, the March statement about no decisions being made wouldn't read as a reversal. It would read as a normal business taking a measured approach to growth. But the impulse to immediately frame the inventory as proof of success to get ahead of the story with a confident explanation that couldn't survive contact with a direct question 8 weeks later, that's the pattern. That's the same impulse that required a pseudonym before anyone knew who she was. That requires multiple security escorts at a fashion show where other celebrities with far bigger global profiles managed to sit down without the apparatus. That requires a People magazine exclusive about missing grocery shopping, while actual public appearances suggest the level of recognition may not match the level of performance. And the warehouse sits there full of product that was manufactured for a market it's certified for, while the international markets it was supposedly built to serve remain inaccessible behind regulatory walls that were always there, always documented. Always available to anyone who bothered to check before placing a manufacturing order for 220,000 jars. The 12-category trademark suggests the plan was always bigger than jam. The Netflix exit suggests the partnership was always more fragile than the public statements indicated. The 8-week reversal suggests the public explanations were always more flexible than the regulatory reality would permit. And Harry's reported despair about soaring costs suggests the gap between the performance and the financial reality is getting harder to maintain from inside the household itself. This is the thing about building a brand on the performance of success, rather than the substance of it. The performance requires constant maintenance. The explanations require constant updating. The contradictions accumulate faster than the press releases can manage them. And eventually a website glitch or a direct question from a journalist or a regulatory document that's been publicly available the whole time comes along, and the gap between what was said and what is true becomes visible to everyone at the same time. 220,000 jars of jam in a California warehouse, and the explanation for why they're there changed in 8 weeks, because the first explanation couldn't survive contact with a reporter who asked a follow-up question. That's not a conspiracy. That's not a palace hit job. That's a brand contradicting itself in its own words on its own timeline, and the regulatory architecture that makes the original explanation impossible was sitting there in public documents the entire time, waiting for someone to check.